Smokewalker. Chapter 1. The ash-kissed breath. The rain wasn't water. It was ash. A perpetual gray drizzle that coated everything in the Cinder-Lung Reach the skin. The rusted iron of abandoned watchtowers. The skeletal remains of trees clawing at a sky choked with volcanic dust. It smelled of burnt bone and regret, a scent that had become as familiar to Zen as his own ragged breath, or rather, the absence thereof. He didn't breathe, not truly. The Void-Bellows, a grotesque assemblage of oiled leather and scavenged bellows valves grafted to his chest, served only to filter the agony of the world, an unending tide of suffering he exhaled as thick, oily smoke a perpetual suffocating shroud. Zen moved through the canyons like a phantom, a ripple in the gray, the only color being the indigo cloth wrapped around his limbs and the unnerving, pulsating glow of Hoot, the Ember-Owl, perched perpetually on his shoulder. Hoot wasn't a creature of instinct, he was a construct, a solidified echo of warmth born from the last desperate flicker of a mother's love, a mother who, like so many others, had been consumed by the Shogun's pyre. He wasn't searching for anything, not consciously. He followed the trails of desperation, the faint, lingering scent of extinguished hope. He was a predator of sorrow, drawn to the pockets of suffering like a moth to a dying flame. Today, the scent was particularly potent, laced with the metallic tang of blood and the brittle whisper of forgotten names. Ahead, the canyon walls narrowed, revealing a clearing dominated by a crumbling watchtower, one of many that had once formed the skeleton of the Shogun's defenses. Around the base of the tower, a group of villagers huddled, their faces pale and hollow, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. They were Ashen-Walkers, victims of the Forge-Master Shogun's terrifying practice, Pyre-Slavery. The Shogun Lord Kaito ruled the Cinder-Lung Reach with a fist forged in volcanic rock and a soul devoured by obsession. He had discovered a way to harness the residual heat of a captive star, a celestial anomaly head dragged from the desolate wastes, and convert it into an endless supply of fuel. But the fuel wasn't simple coal or wood. It was the memories of the living. Each night, villagers were forced into the central furnace, their minds systematically stripped and burned, the resulting ash meticulously refined into a potent substance that powered the Shogun's empire. Zen had been tracking this particular group for 3 days. Their vacant stares and robotic movements were a familiar, heartbreaking tableau. Had encountered dozens like them, each a testament to Kaito's cruelty. He wasn't driven by altruism, not in the conventional sense. He wasn't seeking to save them. He was driven by a deeper, more primal need, a hunger for the extinguished spark, for the final, quiet darkness that completed the cycle of loss. He approached silently, the oily smoke emanating from his Void-Bellows swirling around him, momentarily obscuring his figure. The Ashen-Walkers didn't react, their glazed eyes fixed on some unseen horror. He knelt beside a young woman, no more than 17, her skin dusted with ash, clutching a shard of what might have once been a porcelain doll. "You remember something?" Zen asked, his voice a dry rasp, a collection of sand and regret. She didn't respond. A guard, a cinder guard, a warrior encased in perpetually white-hot armor, stepped forward, his blade a bar of molten steel gleaming with an infernal light. These guards were extensions of the Shogun's will, animated by the burning memories they guarded. They were immune to pain, driven only by the instinct to protect the flames. "Silence, trespasser," the cinder guard growled, his voice crackling with heat. "You will be fed to the fire." Zen didn't draw his weapon, Ghost-Soot. He didn't need to. His body was already a negation of violence, a vessel of emptiness. He simply exhaled, and the obsidian needles erupted from the Void-Bellows, a blizzard of sharp, black fragments that slammed into the guard's armor, shattering its protective layers and forcing the warrior to stumble, his movements abruptly seized by the jagged protrusions. Hoot, sensing the shift in the immediate danger, unfolded his wings of cooling lava, creating a miniature vortex of heat around Zen's head. The air shimmered, and the obsidian needles solidified instantly, becoming a suffocating veil. The Cinder Guard's screams were swallowed by the swirling smoke. As the guard's soul detached, a wisp of gray, he collapsed to the ground, an empty husk. Zen moved with unsettling speed, his steps barely disturbing the ash. He approached the young woman, gently placing a hand on her arm. There is a flicker," he said, his voice barely audible above the hiss of his Void-Bellows. "Don't fight it. Let it go." The woman's eyes flickered with a momentary awareness, a fleeting image of a laughing child, a sun-drenched meadow, then vanished completely. Zen watched, a detached observer in a landscape of sorrow, the smoke from his lungs thickening around him, a tangible representation of his own unending darkness. He was the Smoke Walker, a ghost in a world consumed by flame. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that his journey had just begun. Chapter 2. The echo of Rust the Dawn in the Cinder-Lung Reach wasn't a sunrise, not truly. It was a bruised, sickly gray that bled from the perpetual smoke, a slow, agonizing emergence from a night of absolute stillness. The ash, now cool and heavier, clung to everything, the skeletal remains of buildings, the few hesitant wildflowers stubbornly pushing through, the blackened earth, even the polished obsidian of Zen's blade. He moved through this landscape like a phantom, a ripple in the gloom, the only sound his partner, Hoot, emitting a low, rhythmic pulse, a calming thrum of cooling lava, that resonated in the bone-deep silence. They hadn't rested. The assassination of the Shogun, though decisive, had been a brutal, exhausting exercise in negation. Zen had felt, not with physical sensation, but with a terrifying amplified awareness, the agonizing severance of countless souls, the final shuddering collapse of the Pyre-Slavery system. It wasn't a victory, it was a meticulous dismantling, layer by layer, of a horror he hadn't initiated, yet was irrevocably bound to. Their objective now wasn't simply the Shogun's death, but the dispersal of the memory cores, the crystalline reservoirs of stolen consciousness that fueled the furnaces. These cores, pulsing with fractured memories, were scattered throughout the fortress, nested within the living coal, embedded in the walls of the sanctum, even woven into the very fabric of the Cinder Guard's armor. Removing them was the only way to truly break the cycle of Ashen-Walking. They moved with a preternatural grace, guided by Hoot's heat-seeking gaze. The Ember-Owl, now a deeper, richer red from the residual heat of the Shogun's destruction, navigated the labyrinthine corridors with unsettling accuracy, his wings casting flickering shadows that danced with the smoke. Zen followed, an extension of the darkness, his Ghost-Soot blade already detecting the subtle emanations of the memory cores, tiny, furious sparks of pain and regret. They encountered resistance, predictably. The remaining Cinder Guards, stripped of their Shogun's command and riddled with the effects of their own severed memories, were a chaotic mess. Some were driven mad, screaming fragments of forgotten lives, while others moved with a terrifying vacant obedience, still clinging to protocols long since rendered meaningless. They weren't warriors anymore, they were animated echoes, trapped in a perpetual loop of violence. The first encounter was with a squad of 3, their armor still radiating an oppressive heat. They didn't attack with the overwhelming force of the initial assault. Instead, they moved with a strange, almost ritualistic precision, each strike aimed at a single point, the temples, the throat, the joints. Zen met their aggression with a series of controlled exhales. He created miniature obsidian storms, each one precisely calibrated to disrupt their movements, to sever the connections between their ravaged minds and their decaying bodies. Hoot, anticipating their movements, unleashed blasts of concentrated heat, forcing the warriors to recoil. The lava owl's heat was less about destruction, and more about agonizing disruption, a localized inferno that stripped away the last vestiges of their fighting spirit. One guard, a young man no older than 20, collapsed, his body a smoking ruin, clutching at his head as if trying to grasp at a phantom. "Don't cling to the rust," Zen murmured, his voice a low rasp, as he examined the core within the warrior's armor, a pulsing crimson shard that radiated the memory of a lost daughter. He didn't kill him outright. He simply overwhelmed the core, flooding it with the oily smoke of his Void-Bellows, accelerating the process of disintegration until only a fine gray dust remained. The process was oddly clinical. There was no triumph, no catharsis. Only the cold, sterile observation of a system collapsing. A spark extinguished. They moved deeper into the sanctum, the air growing hotter, thicker, the scent of burnt memories overpowering. The memory cores were concentrated here, woven into the very architecture of the chamber, pulsing within the living coal that formed the heart of the mountain. Suddenly, Hoot emitted a sharp, panicked pulse, a high-pitched screech of cooling lava. Ahead, blocking their path, was a single figure, a cinder guard, but, unlike the others, this one was encased in a full, articulated suit of armor, radiating an almost unbearable heat. This was Commander Viridian, the Shogun's most loyal and perhaps most terrifying lieutenant. His armor was not merely white-hot. It was stained with the solidified tears of countless victims. And in his hands, he held a weapon, a staff forged from pulsating, crystallized memory. Viridian moved with a terrifying speed, channeling the stolen memories into his staff. He unleashed a barrage of searing energy, forcing Zen to rely entirely on his own defenses, a swirling vortex of obsidian needles that deflected the blasts, shattering against the staff's energy field. "You cannot stop what is inevitable," Viridian rasped, his voice distorted by the channeled memories. "The flame consumes all. Memory is merely fuel." Zen didn't respond. He simply enveloped himself in a deeper layer of smoke, a black shroud that swallowed the light, rendering him invisible. He struck with the full asphyxiation strike, a desperate, concentrated effort to neutralize the commander's power. He didn't aim for Viridian's body, he aimed for the staff, for the corrupted core of stolen consciousness. As he plunged his blade into the pulsing crystal, a shockwave of pure, agonizing memory ripped through the chamber, throwing Zen back, his lungs burning, his Void-Bellows screaming in protest. He lay there, gasping, Hoot fluttering frantically around his head, his crimson glow threatening to engulf Zen entirely. The fight had shifted. This wasn't just about extinguishing a flame, it was about facing the echoes of a shattered soul. And Zen, the smoke walker, knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was where his journey truly began. Chapter 3. Echoes in obsidian, the chamber pulsed with a sickly, iridescent light, a residue of Viridian's frantic assault. Die. Zen lay sprawled amidst a slick obsidian mosaic fragments of shattered memories, clinging to the floor like morbid confetti. Hoot, exhausted from his frantic circling, settled on Zen's chest, a tiny, furious ember against the gray pallor of his skin. The Void-Bellows choked, a ragged, painful rasp echoing in the oppressive silence. He pushed himself up, a movement that felt like liquid dragging against his ravaged frame. The air itself tasted of burnt regret, of the countless stolen lives clinging to the walls. Viridian hadn't vanished, but his presence was woven into the very fabric of the room, a fractured tapestry of tormented minds. Zen realized, with a sickening clarity, that the fight wasn't just against a man, it was against the accumulated weight of his stolen soul. "You are a fool, Smoke Walker." Viridian's voice crackled from the shadows, a chorus of whispers layered with the screams of the forgotten. "To fight the inevitable is to invite annihilation. Your honor is nothing but a fragile shield against the storm." Zen ignored him, focusing on the throbbing agony in his chest, the desperate struggle of his Void-Bellows. He reached for Ghost-Soot. The katana felt strangely warm in his hand, as if drawing strength from the lingering pain. The obsidian blade shimmered, momentarily solidifying, its edges blurring into the swirling smoke that clung to him. Viridian, sensing the shift, unleashed another torrent of energy. This time, the blasts weren't raw power, they were intricate, targeted assault shards of fragmented memories, focused into razor-sharp beams. Zen deflected them with a controlled, almost balletic grace, each obsidian needle slicing through the air, a dark counterpoint to the swirling violet of Viridian's attack. He moved like a wraith, fueled by nothing but the stubborn refusal to succumb to oblivion. He realized then that Viridian wasn't simply wielding stolen memories, he was living them. Each attack was a fragment of a tormented past, a desperate plea for recognition, a reflection of the soul's fractured identity. The commander's armor, once a pristine white, was now marred with swirling patterns of silver and gray ghostly echoes of the memories he had consumed. Zen adjusted his tactics. Instead of outright defense, he began to absorb the fragments. He focused his Void-Bellows, drawing the chaotic energy of the memories into his own being. It was a dangerous gambit, a perilous dance with the abyss, but he needed to understand Viridian, to unravel the corrupted core of his power. As he did, visions flooded his mind, a young boy learning the art of the sword, a woman weeping over a lost child, a soldier's last desperate charge, all interwoven with the chilling sensation of being devoured. He saw Viridian's origin, a warrior consumed by grief after a devastating defeat, a man warped by a desperate desire for vengeance. "You are becoming part of me," Viridian shrieked, his voice laced with a horrified understanding. "You are feeding my flames." Zen didn't flinch. He continued to absorb, growing heavier, his smoke veil deepening, becoming almost impenetrable. He felt a nascent understanding of Viridian's despair, a faint echo of the man's broken spirit. But it was a dangerous empathy, a slippery slope towards losing himself entirely. Suddenly, Hoot emitted a high-pitched screech, a surge of crimson light erupting from the owl's form. The light intensified, coalescing into a blinding beam that struck Viridian directly, forcing him to stumble back. The commander roared in fury, his energy field flickering erratically. "You dare interfere, avian mockery!" Zen seized the opportunity. He launched himself forward, Ghost-Soot, a black streak in the swirling smoke. This time, he didn't aim for Viridian's body, he aimed for the staff, the pulsing crystal that served as the conduit for his stolen power. As Ghost-Soot plunged into the crystal, a wave of pure, agonizing memory exploded outwards, a psychic tsunami that ripped through the chamber. Zen was thrown against a wall, his Void-Bellows shattering, the oily smoke pouring from his chest. He lay there, battered and broken, the air around him thick with the agonizing screams of countless trapped souls. But as the initial shock subsided, Zen felt something shift within him. The pain remained, a dull, persistent throb, but it was overlaid with a strange clarity. He understood now, Viridian wasn't simply feeding on memories, he was projecting them, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of suffering. The stolen memories weren't fuel, they were a prison, a cage constructed by Viridian's own fractured mind. He looked at Viridian, who stood amidst a swirling vortex of shattered consciousness, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. "The flame doesn't consume," Zen said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It simply reflects." He raised Ghost-Soot, the obsidian blade now shimmering with an almost ethereal blue light, a reflection of the memories he had absorbed, a key to unlocking their release. The Smokewalker was no longer just a shadow, he was a mirror, ready to show Viridian the truth of his own existence. Chapter 4. Echoes in Obsidian. The silence following Zen's strike was more terrifying than the psychic maelstrom. It wasn't the absence of sound. but the palpable weight of 1,000 broken minds, suspended in the air like iridescent dust. Viridian, stripped of his power and consumed by the chaotic fragments of stolen memories, wasn't a roaring furnace anymore. He was a shattered vase, leaking shards of anguish and regret. His skin, once a vibrant, almost incandescent crimson, had dulled to a bruised violet, the edges shimmering with the fractured light of 1,000 lifetimes. Hoot, perched precariously on Zen's shoulder, emitted a low, mournful chime, a vibration that seemed to soothe the lingering psychic tremors. The owl's charcoal feathers pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow, as if mimicking the fading embers of the imprisoned souls. Zen, struggling to his feet, felt the Void-Bellows reforming, a slow, agonizing process of drawing in the residual pain and transforming it into a manageable darkness. The oily smoke issuing from his chest was now less a weapon and more a sorrowful shroud. "You sought to build a kingdom of shadows," Zen said, his voice now a near-silent rasp, "but all you created was an echo chamber." He gestured with Ghost-Soot, the obsidian blade still pulsing with that unsettling blue light. "This isn't destruction, Viridian. This is release." Viridian, or what remained of him, didn't respond with words. Instead, he began to thrash, a whirlwind of fractured consciousness. Images flickered around him: a samurai facing a charging lancer, a geisha weeping under a paper lantern, a child laughing in a blossoming cherry orchard, each one a stolen fragment of a life, now convulsing with unbearable longing. Zen moved with a chilling grace, navigating the chaotic currents of Viridian's fractured mind, Ghost-Soot a constant, rhythmic presence, slicing through the air not with aggression, but with a measured, almost surgical precision. He wasn't attacking Viridian's physical form, not directly. He was dismantling the architecture of his madness, the carefully constructed walls of illusion, built from stolen memories. With each stroke of the blade, a section of the swirling vortex of consciousness collapsed, releasing a wave of clarity, and momentarily, a flicker of recognition in the eyes of the trapped souls. A young woman, her face etched with the vacant stare of an Ashen-Walker, gasped, clutching at her head. "My father, I remember the scent of plum blossoms." The image vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the seed of recognition had been planted. A grizzled warrior, his body a husk of burned ambition, shuddered, whispering, the taste of sake and the warmth of a wife's hand. Zen continued his work, systematically dismantling Viridian's prison. He observed a disturbing detail: the staff, the conduit for Viridian's power, wasn't merely a channel, it was a mirror. Each shard of stolen memory reflected back a distorted version of Viridian's own desires, amplifying his isolation, fueling his ambition, solidifying his control. "The instrument of your suffering," Zen murmured, his gaze fixed on the pulsating crystal, "is also the key to your undoing." He raised Ghost-Soot again, this time aiming not for the crystal itself, but for the intricate network of glyphs carved into its surface, runes of manipulation, symbols of control, etched with the stolen echoes of countless lives. With a single fluid motion, he plunged the blade into the deepest glyph, a spiral representing the cycle of obsession. The effect was immediate and devastating. The vortex of consciousness intensified, not with rage, but with a horrifying, agonizing sorrow. Viridian screamed not a roar, but a keening wail that resonated through the very fabric of the chamber, a scream of profound loneliness, of unfulfilled longing, of the unbearable weight of stolen lives. As the final glyph shattered, the crystal imploded, releasing a final blinding burst of white light. When the light subsided, Viridian was gone. The chamber was silent, the only evidence of his existence, a scattering of ash, and a few meticulously arranged, perfectly preserved objects, a single wilted cherry blossom, a worn leather-bound book filled with faded calligraphy, a child's wooden toy carved in the shape of a dragon. Zen knelt beside the objects, Hoot nudging his hand with a warm, pulsating feather. He wasn't a monster, Zen said softly, picking up the cherry blossom. He was a broken man, desperately trying to fill a void with the fragments of others' lives, a reflection of his own emptiness. He carefully placed the blossom on a smooth, flat stone. "The memory slaves are free," he added, observing the subtle shift in the air, the faintest hint of warmth returning to the ash-choked canyons. "But the greatest battle," he sighed, exhaling a cloud of oil-black smoke, "is always against the echoes within." Turning, he began to walk towards the exit, his footsteps silent in the cooling ash, leaving behind the remnants of Viridian's shattered empire, and the knowledge that even the deepest darkness can be pierced by a single, unwavering spark of empathy. The Smokewalker, a solitary figure in a world of ghosts, continued his journey, forever shadowed by the echoes of those he had saved. Chapter 5. The Echo of Grief. The first rays of a bruised violet dawn bled through the fissures of the Cinder-Lung Reach, painting the perpetual sootfall in shades of sorrow. The air, though still heavy with the scent of burnt memory, possessed a quality it hadn't held in decades, a dampness, a nascent chill. The villagers, their faces still etched with the trauma of oblivion, stirred, a hesitant, bewildered movement like dormant things, awakening from a profound sleep. They didn't recognize each other immediately, a poignant testament to the complete erasure of their pasts, but a shared instinctual understanding bloomed a primal recognition of liberation. Zen, his form a shifting silhouette against the dying gloom, followed their tentative recovery. Hoot, now radiating a softer, amber glow, perched on his shoulder, its presence a small reassurance in the unsettlingly quiet landscape. He wasn't a leader, not in any conventional sense. He simply was, a consequence of the Stormhead unleashed, a monument to the desperate, silent act of restoration. They moved towards the remnants of the Forge-Master's palace, now a grotesque sculpture of charred stone and fractured obsidian. The Cinder Guards, their bodies mostly reduced to cinders, lay scattered across the courtyard, unsettlingly immobile, like petrified mourners. Several of the younger villagers, driven by an instinctive urge, began to cautiously collect the finer fragments of the obsidian, believing it possessed a unique resonance, a shard of the Shogun's madness. Zen watched them, a melancholic stillness about him. This was the cost of a victory built on oblivion, a people grappling with the void, trying to understand its genesis. "The echoes linger," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp, barely audible above the whisper of the falling soot. "They are not ghosts, not in the way you might imagine. They are the reverberations of a stolen song." He stopped before a shattered mosaic depicting scenes of the Shogun's reign, opulent gatherings, forced smiles, and the relentless construction of the pyre. The mosaic was now a chaotic tapestry of gray and black, yet within the fragments, Zen could almost perceive the faces of those he'd rescued, caught in a perpetual silent scream. Suddenly, a single figure detached itself from the crowd, a young woman, perhaps no older than 20, her eyes wide with a nascent recognition. She clutched a small, intricately carved wooden dragon, a toy her father had made for her, and began to weep. "Denounced, you have run where the being not girl? Not a scream of anguish, but a slow, racking sob, a release of pent-up grief that resonated with a chilling clarity. Zen approached her, not with words, but with a slow, deliberate exhale of smoke. The smoke enveloped her, not to harm, but to soothe, a cool balm against the burning wound of her lost memories. Hoot fluttered around her, radiating a focused warmth, and she leaned into the embrace of the Ember-Owl, finding a fragile comfort in its incandescent glow. As the smoke dissipated, the woman looked up at Zen, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "My father, he used to tell me stories," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Stories of heroes, of justice, of light." She struggled for a moment, grasping at the fragments, and then, with a sudden heartbreaking clarity, she exclaimed, "He was a blacksmith! He made weapons. Beautiful, strong weapons." The sound of her remembered joy, however brief, was a sharp, painful contrast to the pervasive despair. Zen felt a familiar, aching pressure in his chest, a resonance with her grief, a confirmation of the immense weight of the stolen lives. He realized then, with a chilling certainty, that even the act of liberation carried its own profound sorrow. "The weapon against emptiness is not always steel," he said, his voice laced with weariness. "Sometimes, it's simply recognition." He began to walk towards the entrance of the shattered palace, intending to depart, to fade back into the shadows. But then, he paused. He noticed that one of the villagers was attempting to reconstruct a section of the mosaic. He wasn't skilled, simply collecting shards and arranging them haphazardly. Zen approached the young man, and for the first time since arriving in the Cinder-Lung Reach, he used his Ghost-Soot, not to fight, but to guide. He exhaled a delicate tendril of smoke, gently directing the young man's hands, showing him the correct angles, the proper alignment of the fragments. It wasn't instruction, not really. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible demonstration of a lost skill, a memory, carefully resurrected. As the young man completed the mosaic fragment, a perfect, if slightly distorted, representation of a warrior wielding a sword, Zen realized the true nature of his purpose. He wasn't merely extinguishing a tyrant, he was planting the seeds of remembrance, fostering the slow, agonizing process of recovery. "The light doesn't always return," he said, looking at the reconstructed mosaic, its fractured beauty a poignant symbol of their journey. "Sometimes, it is born anew, from the ashes of what was lost." Hoot emitted a soft, affirming hum, and Zen, the smoke walker, continued his walk toward the horizon, a solitary figure against the perpetual twilight, a guardian of echoes, forever walking the line between shadow and remembrance. Chapter 6. The Weaver of Echoes. The air in the Cinder-Lung Reach remained a bruised purple, stained with the perpetual twilight of ashfall. The scent of burnt bone and ozone clung to everything, a constant sickening reminder of the Shogun's reign. Yet, something was shifting. The air, once thick with the suffocating despair of the Ashen-Walkers, held a nascent tremor of hope. The villagers, slowly regaining their identities, were no longer simply reacting to their newfound memories, they were actively shaping them, imbuing them with purpose. Zen observed this change from the crumbling steps of the palace. Hoot perched silently on his shoulder, the owl's charcoal eyes reflecting the flickering glow of the newly rekindled hearths within the rebuilt village. He wore the gray of 1,000 extinguished flames now, his skin pale and almost translucent, the Void-Bellows a constant, silent exhalation. The villagers, tentatively at first, began to approach him, not with fear or reverence, but with a hesitant curiosity. They weren't seeking a warrior god, but a craftsman of lost things. A young woman, her face still etched with the confusion of fragmented existence, approached him carrying a chipped ceramic bowl. It was crudely painted with a stylized crane, a symbol of longevity and hope. I remember my grandmother," she stammered, her voice raw from disuse. "She made these. She told me stories of the river, of singing birds. Her fingers traced the imperfect lines of the crane. I want to finish it, make it beautiful again." Zen didn't offer instruction, not in the conventional sense. Instead, he produced Ghost-Soot, a single, viscous thread of solidified smoke, and gently guided her hand. He didn't dictate the brushstrokes, but subtly influenced her movements, showcasing the precise curve of a wing, the delicate shading of a feather. It was a dance of suggestion, a whispering of forgotten techniques of memory, meticulously reconstructed. More villagers followed, drawn by the silent demonstration. A former blacksmith, now struggling to recall the heat of the forge, painstakingly shaped a metal shard with Zen's guidance, recreating a small, intricately detailed dragon, a symbol of his clan's ancient lineage. A young weaver attempted to replicate a complex geometric pattern in woven fibers, the smoke acting as a spectral loom, illustrating the flow and tension of the threads. Zen realized he wasn't just extinguishing the shogun's fire, he was cultivating a new kind of ignition. He was a weaver of echoes, meticulously reconstructing the fragments of their lost lives, not to restore them exactly as they were, but to provide the potential for them to be reborn. Each resurrected skill, each replicated symbol, was a tiny, defiant act of reclamation. The shogun's former guards, the Cinder Guards, were observing from a distance, a silent, simmering menace. They hadn't been entirely vanquished, merely neutralized. Their armor, still radiating an unnatural heat, was being painstakingly dismantled by the villagers, the metal slowly cooling and becoming pliable under Zen's subtle influence. They weren't seeking revenge, but understanding. They wanted to know what had broken the shogun's power, and perhaps to find a way to prevent it from happening again. As the afternoon wore on, a figure emerged from the reconstructed village, Kenji, the young man who had begun the mosaic. He approached Zen, his face streaked with soot and sweat, holding a flawlessly assembled section depicting a warrior wielding Ghost-Soot, a perfect echo of Zen himself. "I understand now," Kenji said, his voice firm, infused with a newfound conviction. "It's not about returning what was lost, it's about building what can be." He gestured to the sprawling mosaic, now a vibrant tapestry of fractured memories and burgeoning skill. "You aren't simply erasing the shogun's darkness, you're layering it with light." Zen considered this, the rasp of his breath a low counterpoint to the quiet industry of the village. The shogun sought to control the past, to confine it to a single, burning flame. He believed memory was a weapon, a tool of subjugation. But memory is a river. It flows, it changes, it adapts. It can carve new paths, build new bridges. He turned towards the horizon, the setting sun painting the ash clouds in hues of bruised orange and crimson. He sought to extinguish the light. But even in the deepest darkness, a spark remains. And sometimes, a spark needs only a thread of smoke to ignite. Hoot shifted on Zen's shoulder, emitting a low, resonant hum, a subtle vibration that seemed to coalesce into a feeling of profound, unsettling peace. Suddenly, a chorus of shouts erupted from the village. The Cinder Guards, led by a grizzled veteran named Taro, had moved in, not with aggression, but with a solemn procession. They carried not weapons, but a collection of tools, chisels, hammers, files meticulously crafted by the villagers, each imbued with a fragment of a forgotten skill. Taro approached Zen, his expression grim but respectful. "We came to offer our service," he said, his voice hoarse. "We've learned a thing or two. We believe that this palace wasn't simply a prison for a shogun. It was a crucible, a place where memories were forged and broken and eventually shaped." He paused, looking at the completed mosaic. At the villagers diligently working, at Zen, the smoke walker, standing silent and watchful. "Perhaps," he said softly, "the true victory isn't about destroying the past, but about learning to live with it and to build a future from the fragments." Zen simply nodded, exhaling a tendril of black smoke that dissolved into the twilight, a silent acknowledgement of a shifting tide, a testament to the slow, agonizing, and ultimately beautiful process of remembering. The fire within the Cinder-Lung Reach was not being quenched, but carefully, deliberately, transformed. Chapter 7. The Architect of Echoes. The scent of iron and cooling coal hung heavy in the air, mingled now with the faint, bittersweet aroma of returning herbs and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the perpetual bitterness of the Shogun's reign. The villagers, no longer the Ashen-Walkers, moved with a hesitant purpose, their hands instinctively reaching for the tools Taro had presented. They weren't rebuilding the palace, not entirely. Instead, they were meticulously reconstructing fragments of the Shogun's chamber, transforming the raw, scorched stone into something deliberate. Zen observed them, a detached sentinel amidst the nascent activity. Hoot, perched on his shoulder, pulsed with a rhythmic light, a subtle counterpoint to the growing warmth emanating from the villagers' efforts. He realized, with a disconcerting clarity, that Taro and his people weren't simply attempting to undo the Shogun's work. They were attempting to understand it. "You seek to decipher a language written in flame," Zen said, his voice a dry rasp, startling a young girl who was painstakingly carving a miniature forge into a block of obsidian. The Shogun didn't merely burn memories, he arranged them. He sculpted them with heat and intent. Taro, a man etched with the hardship of a lifetime spent under the Shogun's oppressive rule, met Zen's gaze. "We've seen the patterns, Ronin," he replied, wiping sweat from his brow. The way the flames pulsed, the angles of the furnaces, the meticulous arrangement of the star fragments, it wasn't chaos. It was a design. A terrible, beautiful design. The villagers, now a small but dedicated team, were recreating a section of the Shogun's central chamber, a circular dais, where Head conducted his memory forgings. They were laying down tiles of polished basalt, each one meticulously inscribed with symbols derived from the fragments of memories they'd recovered. A blacksmith's hammer, a child's lullaby, the scent of a plum blossom. They weren't replicating the Shogun's oppressive aesthetic, they were attempting to reconstruct the context of his actions, to understand the logic behind his madness. As they worked, Zen noticed a recurring motif in their reconstruction spirals. Complex, interwoven spirals carved into the basalt, etched into the obsidian tools, even subtly woven into the patterns of the smoke he exhaled. Hoot emitted a sharper, more insistent hum, its glow intensifying. "The owl recognizes it," Zen murmured, examining the intricate spiral carvings. "The heat-seeker, it senses the truth within the echoes." Taro, guided by a wizened elder named Hana, stepped forward, holding aloft a completed fragment of the dais, a perfectly rendered spiral. "We believe this was a device, Ronin," he explained, his voice laced with a tentative excitement. "A way to amplify and manipulate the memories, to draw them out of the living and shape them into fuel. But it wasn't a tool of dominion, not entirely. It was a vessel, a way to understand the very nature of memory itself." Suddenly, a tremor ran through the chamber. The ground vibrated with a low guttural groan. The star fragment, the source of the Shogun's power, pulsed erratically, casting dancing shadows across the newly formed mosaic. The villagers recoiled in fear, but Hoot remained steadfast, its glow unwavering. Zen understood. The Shogun hadn't simply used the star fragment to fuel his furnace. Had attempted to control it, to impose his will upon its vast, untamed energy. And in doing so, had created a feedback loop, a psychic resonance that was now threatening to unravel the very fabric of their efforts. He raised his hand, and a swirling column of black smoke erupted from his chest, solidifying into a shimmering barrier around the dais. The erratic pulsations of the star fragment diminished, its chaotic energy contained. "The forge is unstable," Zen said, his voice strained. "The Shogun's influence lingers, attempting to reassert itself. We must not simply rebuild, we must contain." He directed the villagers to reinforce the barrier with intricately carved obsidian spirals, mimicking the patterns they'd discovered. As they worked, Hoot's glow reached a fever pitch, and a wave of clarity washed over Zen. He realized that the Shogun hadn't been simply hoarding memories. had been trying to rewrite history. The key, Zen realized, is not to recreate the past, but to nullify the attempt, to shatter the illusion of control. He turned to Taro, a new determination hardening his gaze. We will not rebuild the Shogun's palace. We will rebuild him. We will rebuild his memory forge, but with a different purpose. We will turn his own tools against him. The air crackled with energy as the villagers, inspired by Zen's vision, began to modify their work, subtly altering the patterns, introducing counter-spirals, a final devastating key to the mechanism. The shard of obsidian in Zen's hand began to pulse with a dark, malevolent light. It was time to quench the final flicker of the iron gate. Chapter 8. The Weaver of Silence. The air in the shattered heart of the forge was thick with the scent of cooling coal, and something else, a metallic tang laced with the ghosts of 1,000 extinguished lives. The obsidian spirals, now a shimmering tapestry of interlocking patterns, pulsed with a subdued violet light, a fragile bulwark against the residual chaos radiating from the collapsed memory forge. Taro, sweat plastering his dark hair to his forehead, meticulously adjusted one of the spirals, his movements precise and deliberate, mirroring Zen's own unnerving calm. The resonance is still agitated, Hoot hissed, his charcoal feathers vibrating with a low, unsettling hum. The Shogun's essence clings to the core like ash to a dying ember. It's trying to weave. Zen remained motionless, his Void-Bellows working with a quiet, almost hypnotic rhythm. The oily smoke that perpetually curled from his lungs thickened, coalescing into a swirling, sentient darkness that seemed to drink in the light. He wasn't merely observing, he was listening, feeling the frantic, desperate attempts of the Shogun's fractured consciousness to regain control. It was a battle waged not with steel, but with the very fabric of existence. It's feeding on the returned memories, Zen said, his voice a low rumble, amplifying them, twisting them, as attempting to rebuild his power not with fuel, but with the echoes of our past. Taro, a young man once a farmer, now a craftsman molded by Zen's harsh instruction, stopped his work. So, we must silence them entirely? Zen shook his head, a single gray strand of hair drifting from his scalp. Silence is not the answer. To silence is to invite oblivion. We must rewrite them. We must become the weavers of a new reality. One thread of truth at a time. He raised Ghost-Soot, the obsidian blade shimmering with an unnatural darkness. The Shogun's core is vulnerable. We will not strike at its power, but at its narrative. The modified obsidian shard in Zen's hand pulsed brighter, mirroring the violet intensity of the spirals. It was no longer just a weapon, it was an instrument, a conduit for a carefully constructed negation. He began to move, not with a traditional attack, but with a series of deliberate, almost ritualistic gestures. He exhaled a slow, deliberate stream of smoke, shaping it into complex geometric patterns, mimicking the counter-spirals the villagers had begun to etch into the surrounding stone. Each movement was imbued with a profound sense of sorrow, a deliberate projection of absence. He believes in order, in control. Zen murmured, his eyes fixed on the shifting patterns of smoke. Hez trying to impose a single, sterile narrative. We will overwhelm him with the chaos of possibility, with the infinite potential of forgotten moments. As he wove, Hoot emitted a series of high-pitched, almost painful shrieks, each one a focused burst of heat directed at specific points within the swirling smoke. The heat wasn't destructive, it was purifying, burning away the phantom impressions of the Shogun's attempts to manipulate reality. The air grew colder, the violet light intensifying, and the obsidian barriers began to resonate with a strange, disorienting hum. Suddenly the Shogun's consciousness surged, a violent wave of fragmented memories and rage erupting from the core of the forge. The obsidian spirals buckled under the force, threatening to unravel. Taro cried out, bracing himself against the wall, as the very foundations of the chamber shuddered. as trying to force the pattern. Taro shouted, his face pale with terror. Hez creating a loop. A paradox. Zen didn't falter. He intensified his work, the smoke swirling around him like a protective shroud. He wasn't fighting the Shogun, he was unraveling him, thread by thread, collapsing the illusion of his control. Ghost-Soot, now glowing with an almost blinding darkness, danced before him, severing the links between the Shogun's fractured memories, scattering them into the void. The key lies in the disruption, Zen yelled over the escalating chaos, his voice strained. We must introduce an impossible element, a truth he cannot comprehend. He focused all his will, all his being, channeling the last vestiges of the star fragment's energy through the obsidian shard. The shard exploded with a silent, concentrated blast of darkness, not a physical impact, but a wave of pure negation. It wasn't a blow to the Shogun's core, but a disruption to his very perception of reality. For a moment, the chaos ceased. The obsidian spiral stabilized, the violet light softened, and the frantic energy of the Shogun's consciousness subsided. Silence descended, broken only by the steady, rhythmic exhale of Zen's Void-Bellows. Then, from the heart of the collapsed forge, a single, perfect white lotus bloomed. It floated in the center of the chamber, radiating a serene, golden light. The seed of forgotten compassion, Zen whispered, his voice filled with a profound sadness. The Shogun, in his quest for control, extinguished all hope. We plant this seed, and let it grow. Hoot landed on Zen's shoulder, his lava charcoal glow pulsating in time with the lotus. The warrior knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the battle was not yet won, but a crucial stage was completed. The Shogun was gone, not defeated, but simply silenced, erased from the narrative. The smoke walker turned toward the horizon, carrying the scent of cooling ash and the quiet promise of a dawn unburdened by stolen memories. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Gray. The dawn was a bruised plum, bleeding into a bruised gray. The Cinder-Lung Reach was still choked with ash, but the oppressive heat had lessened, replaced by a damp, clinging cold that seeped into bone. The villagers, freed from the Pyre-Slavery, moved with a hesitant grace, their eyes, once vacant and glazed, now reflecting a nascent awareness, a flicker of confusion and nascent grief. They gathered around Zen, not with reverence, not with fear, but with a profound, quiet curiosity. Old man Kenji, a man who had lost decades of his life as fuel, approached Zen, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch, but to trace the outline of Zen's Void-Bellows, as if trying to understand the mechanism of a forgotten art. You are like the rain after a fire, he rasped, his voice rusty with disuse. You cleanse. Zen offered no response, only a slow exhale of smoke, the obsidian needles forming and dissolving around his feet like spectral snowflakes. Hoot, perched on his shoulder, emitted a low, resonant hum, a vibration felt more than heard, a reassurance to the newly awakened. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of tentative rebuilding. The villagers, spurred by a primal instinct to reclaim their lost lives, began to salvage what they could from the ruined forge. They collected fragments of charcoal, painstakingly reshaping them into rudimentary tools. They unearthed seeds, miraculously preserved within the cooled remains of the furnace, and began to cultivate a small, desperate garden, nourished by the meager rain that fell. But Zen remained a solitary figure, a silent sentinel amidst the chaos. He didn't offer guidance, didn't preach, didn't even acknowledge their efforts. He simply was, a constant, gray presence in a world struggling to regain color. It was Hoot, the Ember-Owl, who seemed to serve as a bridge, its steady glow a beacon of hope, a reminder of warmth and life. Days bled into weeks. The violet light that had pulsed from the collapsed forge, the source of the shogun's power, had faded entirely, leaving only a dull metallic sheen on the ravaged walls. The Cinder Guards, stripped of their protective armor and consumed by their own fractured memories, were scattered, rendered useless by the very power they had sworn to protect. Then, whispers began. Whispers of a Shadow Walker, a phantom who had appeared from the heart of the destruction, and delivered the final blow. Whispers of a creature forged from smoke and obsidian, guided by a fiery owl. The villagers, slowly regaining their understanding of the world, began to piece together the events of the previous weeks, building a terrifying narrative of Zen's actions. They saw him not as a savior, but as a harbinger of destruction, a force of cold, unyielding darkness. The fear, however, didn't drive them away. It solidified their resolve. They began to construct a shrine, a small, roughly hewn structure built around the single white lotus, a testament to the possibility of compassion amidst the ashes. They offered it the first fruits of their garden, tiny, vibrant green shoots, a defiant gesture against the pervasive gray. Zen observed from a distance, his face obscured by the swirling smoke. He sensed a shift, a subtle alteration in the village's perception of him. They were no longer solely defined by fear, but by a nascent sense of gratitude, mingled with a deep, unsettling respect. Then, a scouting party, remnants of the Shogun's remaining loyalists' men, stripped of their titles and driven mad by the loss of their memories, arrived. They were clad in ragged, scorched leather, their eyes burning with a fanatical devotion to the vanished shogun. They carried crude, makeshift weapons, sharpened shards of the forge's remains, fueled by desperation and the lingering embers of the shogun's power. They moved with a terrifying, chaotic energy, driven by the delusion that Zen represented the very source of their suffering. They launched a desperate attack, a disorganized flurry of blades and shouts, their intent to silence the Smokewalker once and for all. Zen didn't meet their aggression with force. He moved with the fluidity of smoke, dodging and weaving through the chaos, Hoot's heat-seeking glow illuminating the attacker's movements. He didn't kill, but he neutralized. With a precise, silent exhale, he solidified a layer of obsidian around their limbs, freezing them in place, a monument to their misguided devotion. As the last of the loyalists fell, their movements abruptly halted, their fiery hatred extinguished, a final, chilling whisper of the shogun's influence fading from their minds. Zen turned his gaze toward the shrine, toward the single white lotus, now surrounded by a ring of silent, frozen warriors. He understood now. The shogun hadn't simply been a tyrannical ruler. He had been a reflection of humanity's darkest impulses, the hunger for control, the fear of the unknown, the willingness to sacrifice everything for an illusion of power. And Zen, the Smokewalker, wasn't a destroyer. He was an echo, a consequence, a reminder that even the deepest darkness eventually yields to the smallest spark of remembrance. Chapter 10. The echo of stone. The silence that followed the shogun's collapse was not peaceful, but profoundly unsettling. The Cinder-Lung Reach, already a landscape sculpted by despair, seemed to hold its breath. The falling soot, usually a restless, agitated curtain, had ceased, settling into a thick, greasy blanket that muffled all sound. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with the residue of stolen memory and extinguished flame. Zen, his form now etched with the stark gray of the final cooling, knelt beside the frozen warriors. Hoot, perched on his shoulder, emitted a faint, rhythmic pulse of orange light, scanning the scene with an unnerving, almost sentient awareness. The obsidian restraints, still clinging to the warriors' limbs, pulsed with a cold internal light, mirroring the extinguished embers within their eyes. They weren't corpses, not exactly. They were vessels, filled with a static, vacant echo of their former selves. He didn't touch them, didn't attempt to awaken them. He recognized that the shogun hadn't merely seized control of their minds, had reshaped their very bones, hardening them to match the relentless heat of his dominion. Remaking them was a task that would require a power he no longer possessed, a power born of the very soul he had traded. "The lotus remains untouched," Zen said, his voice a dry rattle, the words barely audible above the settling soot. "A curious monument to a futile faith." Hoot shifted, a subtle tremor of heat rippling through his lava stone form. The owl's glow intensified, focusing on the white lotus, a single pristine bloom nestled within the ring of frozen sentinels. It was unnervingly perfect, radiating a silent warmth that defied the surrounding chill. As Zen studied the lotus, he noticed something he hadn't before: a network of hairline cracks spiderwebbing across its surface. They weren't the result of age or damage, they were patterns of heat, solidified and trapped within the flower's delicate structure. The Shogun's heat hadn't simply consumed the lotus, it had attempted to rewrite it. He understood then. The Shogun hadn't sought to burn memories, had sought to imprint his own, to calcify his will into the fabric of reality. The lotus, a symbol of purity and remembrance, was the final, desperate target of his ambition, a point of resistance he believed he could crush. "A flawed attempt at control," Zen murmured, pulling Ghost-Soot from his sash. The katana seemed to deepen in color, absorbing the surrounding gloom. "The heart of a fire is not a fortress. It's a reflection." With a movement that bordered on impossible, Zen raised the blade. It didn't flash with lethal intent, it simply became. The obsidian sheen deepened, swallowing the light, and he began a slow, deliberate process of fragmentation. Not with a strike, but with a delicate, almost surgical severance. He focused on the cracks in the lotus, using Ghost-Soot to draw out the solidified heat, transforming it into fine, black dust. Each fragment of heat that was released sent a ripple of movement through the frozen warriors. Their limbs shuddered, their vacant eyes flickered with a brief, agonizing spark of recognition. For a heartbeat, they were no longer statues, but tormented souls, caught between the icy grip of the Shogun's influence and the nascent warmth of their lost selves. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. The sparks were extinguished. The movement ceased. The warriors remained frozen, but something had shifted. The obsidian restraints pulsed faintly, as if adjusting to a new equilibrium. Zen finished, lowering Ghost-Soot. As the last fragment of heat was drawn away, the lotus itself began to subtly change. The hairline cracks deepened, becoming fissures of pure white, and the flower pulsed with a soft, renewed warmth. "The echo fades," Zen said, his voice gaining a slight resonance. "But the stone remembers." He turned to Hoot, who was now vibrating with a quiet, insistent energy. "The owl speaks of an anchor, a place where the stolen memories can coalesce, where we can begin to build something new." Hoot tilted his head, his lava stone eyes seeming to penetrate the layers of ash and despair. He emitted a series of precise, measured pulses of heat, each one directed towards a specific point in the distance, a cluster of crumbling, blackened ruins, partially obscured by the falling soot. "The foundry," Zen said, his voice filled with a nascent understanding. "The Shogun's birthplace, the source of his obsession. It's not a place of fire, but of stone, a place built on the foundation of a broken empire." He began to walk, his footsteps silent in the ash, Hoot's glow illuminating the path ahead. The cool air grew thicker, carrying with it the faintest scent of iron and stone. The smoke that clung to his clothes seemed to coalesce around him, wrapping him in a protective shroud. The smoke-walker, a relic of a forgotten age, was walking towards the heart of the Cinder-Lung Reach, not to destroy, but to gather the fragments of a shattered memory and to begin the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding a world lost to flame. Chapter 11. The Weight of Stone. The journey to the foundry was a descent deeper into the Shogun's madness, a slow, suffocating embrace of decay. The falling soot, once a raging torrent, had thinned to a melancholic drizzle, each particle a tiny frozen tear from the ravaged sky. The air tasted not of ash, but of iron, a tang that clung to the back of Zen's throat, a metallic echo of the Shogun's stolen essence. Hoot, unusually restless, circled above, his pulsing glow a frantic heartbeat against the oppressive gloom. He anticipates us, Hoot rasped, the sound a cascade of miniature sparks. The air it's saturated with the residue of his fear. He knows we are coming. Zen didn't respond immediately. The foundry was not a place of immediate confrontation. It was a mausoleum of ambition, a place built on meticulous, obsessive control. And Zen suspected that the Shogun's final act would be a carefully constructed trap. He moved with the patience of a glacier, his Ghost-Soot katana held low, almost an extension of his skeletal frame. The oily smoke clung to him, a second skin that shifted and rippled with every deliberate step. They emerged into a valley dominated by the skeletal remains of the foundry itself. It wasn't a colossal structure like the Shogun's mountain instead. It was a labyrinth of crumbling workshops, ruined forges, and towering, blackened pillars, all constructed of a dark, almost obsidian-like stone. The air here vibrated with a low, persistent hum, the echo of ancient machinery, and, chillingly, the residual heat of countless burning memories. He built it to measure, Zen observed, his gaze sweeping across the devastated landscape, not for creation, but for control. To quantify the loss, to turn it into a tool. Hoot landed on Zen's shoulder, his lava-stone eyes focused on a colossal, partially collapsed forge in the center of the valley. There's a well of heat there, undisturbed, like a dormant pulse. As they approached the forge, the signs of the Shogun's presence became increasingly pronounced. The ground was meticulously swept clean, a stark anomaly in the surrounding chaos. Strange geometric patterns etched into the stone floor, pulsing faintly with residual heat, warned of proximity. And then they saw them, the Guardians. Not the frenzied white-hot cinder guards from the Shogun's main fortress, but something far more insidious. These were automatons, constructs of polished obsidian and pulsating, internal furnaces programmed to defend the foundry's core. They moved with a chillingly precise grace, their movements guided by a silent, internal logic. Each was equipped with a short, brutal spear tipped with a shard of solidified pyre essence. They are echoes, Hoot stated, his heat intensifying. Created from the echoes of the workers who built this place. Driven by a fragmented desire to maintain what was lost. Zen engaged the Guardians first, moving with a terrifying fluidity, a dance of shadow and steel. He didn't meet their attacks head-on. Instead, he used the obsidian veil, unleashing controlled bursts of solidified smoke, each one disrupting the automaton's internal mechanisms with agonizing precision. He didn't kill. He disassembled, severing their connections to the heat, silencing their programmed rage. Ghost-Soot sliced through their obsidian limbs, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air. Hoot supported him, showering the Guardians with focused bursts of heat, causing their internal furnaces to shudder and seize. The automatons crumpled to the ground, their obsidian bodies cooling and cracking. But each destroyed Guardian seemed to trigger a reaction, a subtle shift in the stone, a strengthening of the geometric patterns, a deepening of the humming resonance. "He's testing us," Zen grunted, wiping a smear of oily smoke from his cheek. "Trying to understand our methods. To adapt." As they cleared the immediate area around the forge, they discovered the chamber within a vast circular space dominated by a single immense anvil. It was here, coated in a thick layer of solidified memory ash, that the Shogun had performed his final desperate act of control, the meticulous, soul-burning process that fueled his empire. And on the anvil lay a single, perfectly formed lotus stone, a shard of the original lotus that had once bloomed in the heart of the Shogun's mountain. It was cracked, ravaged by the Shogun's pyre essence, but radiating a faint, stubborn warmth. The anchor, Zen breathed, reaching out a trembling hand. As his fingers brushed against the stone, a jolt of energy surged through him, a torrent of fragmented memories, a young boy learning the art of the sword, a woman's laughter, a field of golden poppies swaying in the breeze. The Shogun hadn't just stolen memories, had attempted to distill them into a weapon, to weaponize loss itself. Suddenly, the geometric patterns on the floor erupted in a blinding flash of heat. The Shogun's voice, cold and devoid of emotion, echoed through the chamber. You cannot control what is already lost. You can only observe. Before Zen could react, a wave of solidified pyre essence, a shimmering, crimson spear slammed into him, forcing him to his knees. Hoot erupted in a furious cascade of sparks, attempting to shield him, but the Shogun's influence was too strong. Zen knew with a sickening certainty that he was not fighting a man, but a concept, a corrupted reflection of order and control. And the weight of that knowledge threatened to extinguish the last flicker of his resolve. Chapter 12. Echoes of the Forge, the crimson spear of pyre essence, still radiating a nauseating heat, lay embedded in Zen's chest, not through flesh but through the solidified memory ash that had become interwoven with his very being. It wasn't a wound, not in the conventional sense. It was a deepening of the void, a locus where the Shogun's control held the most insidious sway. Hoot, scorched and trembling, circled Zen's head, its charcoal feathers shedding tiny sparks that danced like dying embers in the gloom. Zen's breath, a ragged, oily rasp, was momentarily cut off. He felt the cold seep into his bones, the familiar agony of filtration fading, replaced by an unnerving stillness. The Shogun's voice, no longer a booming echo, was now a quiet whisper, directly within his mind. You cling to sentiment, Ronin. A dangerous weakness. Memory is not a tool to be wielded, but a fuel to be consumed. Observe. Understand. Accept the inevitable entropy. He attempted to move. A single, agonizing twitch of his hand. The ash solidified around the spear, a cage of frozen moments, constricting his movement, amplifying the Shogun's influence. He could feel the echoes of his own memories, the fragments of his past, twisting and distorting, becoming warped reflections of the Shogun's control. He saw the boy he once was, a bright-eyed apprentice, a face of grief, etched with the memory of his fallen master, all rendered grotesque by the Shogun's manipulations. You crave honor, the Shogun's voice continued, cold and precise. A futile pursuit. Honor is a fabrication, a comforting lie to mask the truth all things eventually burn. Zen forced himself to focus, to fight the insidious tendrils wrapping around his consciousness. He drew upon the Void-Bellows, expanding his personal shadow, thickening the smoke until it veiled his body in a swirling obsidian curtain. It wasn't a defense, not entirely. It was a channel, a desperate attempt to wrest control back from the invading force. Hoot, sensing the shift, unleashed a focused burst of heat from its core, a searing lance aimed not at the Shogun, but at the spear itself. The impact was violent, a miniature supernova contained within the owl's form. The pyre essence recoiled, momentarily disrupting the connection, allowing Zen a precious few seconds of clarity. The lotus stone Zen gasped, the name a choked whisper. You sought to weaponize it. The Shogun's laughter, dry and brittle, echoed in his mind. The lotus represents potential. I merely harnessed that potential, refining it into a catalyst for absolute dominion. With a supreme effort, Zen channeled his remaining strength, focusing not on attacking, but on absorbing. He expanded the Void-Bellows, drawing the lingering pyre essence, the solidified memory ash, into himself. It was a brutal, agonizing process, like drowning in his own suffering. But it was the only path. He wasn't trying to destroy it, he was trying to understand it, to dissect it, to break its hold. As he did, the geometric patterns on the floor pulsed with a sickening rhythm. the flashes of heat intensifying. The room began to shift, the walls dissolving into a swirling vortex of crimson and gray. Zen realized, with a chilling clarity, that he wasn't fighting a being, he was confronting the logical conclusion of the Shogun's obsession, the embodiment of his corrupted order. A chaotic symphony of stolen memories given form. Suddenly, a single, clear image pierced through the chaos, a hand, weathered and scarred, gently placing a single, perfect lotus blossom into the palm of a child. It was a fleeting memory, but it resonated with a profound and agonizing truth, the origin of the Shogun's power, the seed of his corruption. "You mistake grief for power," Zen said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength, a thread of steel woven through the soot. "You sought to control loss, but loss is the wellspring of all that is. It is the absence that gives meaning to presence." He pulled back the Void-Bellows, unleashing a torrent of black smoke. This time, it wasn't aimed at obscuring, but at unraveling. The solidified memory ash surrounding the spear began to dissolve, fracturing into countless microscopic shards that danced in the swirling smoke. The Shogun's voice screamed in rage, a torrent of distorted sound. "You cannot nullify the foundation of existence. Your efforts are pathetic." But Zen wasn't listening. He focused on the lotus stone, reaching out with his trembling hand. As his fingers brushed against its ravaged surface, he felt a surge of something beyond memory, a raw, untamed energy, a connection to the earth itself. The stone pulsed with warmth, and for a fleeting moment, the suffocating darkness in the chamber lifted, revealing a sliver of the bruised, ash-laden sky. Then, with a final, defiant act, Zen shattered the lotus stone. The fragments didn't burst into flame. Instead, they dispersed, becoming one with the black smoke, absorbed into his own being. The Shogun's voice fell silent. The geometric patterns ceased their pulsing. The vortex of chaos began to subside. Zen collapsed, his body utterly drained, his breath a mere whisper of smoke. Hoot landed on his chest, its ember glow, a fragile beacon in the returning darkness. "You have extinguished the flame," the Shogun's voice, now a distant murmur, said. "But remember this, ronin the embers remain, and they will always seek a way to ignite." Chapter 13. Echoes in obsidian, the silence in the Shogun's ruined sanctum was a heavier thing than the lingering smoke, a palpable absence that pressed against Zen's ribs. Hoot, the Ember-Owl, remained perched on his chest, its charcoal glow a weak, rhythmic pulse against the gray stone. Zen felt himself slowly reassembling. Not physically, the draining had left him a husk of bone and smoke, but in a way that felt deeper, more fundamental. The scattered fragments of stolen memories, the echoes of countless lives consumed, were beginning to coalesce within him, not as his own, but as impressions, fragments of suffering he was now tasked with bearing. The Shogun's statue, a grotesque monument to stolen experience, remained inert. The supernova glow had vanished, leaving only a dull charcoal sheen. Yet, the air still hummed with a residual heat, a faint vibration that spoke of forces barely contained. He wasn't sure if it was a threat, or simply the stubborn insistence of a burnt-out god. "It is quiet," Zen rasped, the sound like stone grinding against stone. He cautiously extended a hand, and the smoke from his Void-Bellows shifted, forming a delicate, almost translucent fan. He tested the air, analyzing its composition, searching for the residual traces of the Shogun's power. It was fainter now, diluted by the dissipation of the lotus stone, but undeniably present a dark, cold signature of obsessive control. "The embers," Hoot chirped, a surprisingly melodic sound given its fiery composition. "They seek the heat." Zen nodded, understanding. The Shogun hadn't merely burned memories, had cultivated them, fed them, weaponized them. To truly defeat him wasn't just about extinguishing the flames, but about understanding the hunger that drove them. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. A tremor ran through the chamber, a low groan of displaced rock. Dust rained down from the vaulted ceiling, and a hairline crack spiderwebbed across the floor, revealing a vein of shimmering obsidian-like material beneath. It pulsed with a dark energy, identical to the one that had fueled the Shogun's power. "A seed," Zen whispered, instinctively drawing Ghost-Soot. The katana seemed to lengthen, its smoky form twisting around him like a protective shroud. He realized with a chilling certainty that the Shogun hadn't been completely eradicated. His essence, his obsessive drive to control and consume, was now manifesting as a nascent core of energy within the earth itself. From the crack in the floor, a single, perfect shard of obsidian erupted. It didn't burn. It didn't explode. Instead, it solidified the smoke swirling around Zen, shaping it into a miniature replica of the Shogun's face, frozen in a perpetual scream. The obsidian visage pulsed with the same malevolent energy Head felt emanating from the statue. "It's learning," Hoot shrieked, launching itself from Zen's chest and diving towards the miniature Shogun. The Ember-Owl's heat lashed out, forcing the obsidian replica to melt back into a shapeless mass. But the process had triggered another tremor, and a second shard emerged, followed by a third. Zen realized he wasn't dealing with a defeated enemy, but with a phenomenon. The Shogun's soul, fragmented and distorted, was actively seeking to reconstitute itself, drawn to the remaining pockets of heat and energy, attempting to reignite its destructive cycle. "We must contain it," Zen commanded, his voice gaining a grim determination. He began to exhale, unleashing a colossal cloud of black smoke, denser than any had produced before. This wasn't a simple obscuration, it was a carefully constructed cage, a vortex of solidified memory ash, designed to absorb and neutralize the Shogun's energy. As the smoke enveloped the chamber, the obsidian shards pulsed violently, attempting to break through the barrier. But Zen countered with precise, calculated bursts of smoke blade strikes, severing the connections between the shards and the core of energy. The process was agonizing, each severance drawing upon his own dwindling reserves. "The price of containment is shy," Hoot observed, its glow flickering dangerously low. Zen ignored him, focusing entirely on the swirling vortex of black smoke. He realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the Shogun hadn't just sought to fuel his own power, Head sought to become the fire itself. And now, he was fighting not just a physical enemy, but a fundamental principle, the desperate, consuming need for order, for control, for absolute dominion. As the last obsidian shard dissolved, the final tremor subsided. The core of energy within the obsidian vein flickered, then stilled. The chamber fell silent once more, the lingering darkness now imbued with a tangible sense of loss. Zen collapsed, his body spent, his breath a thin wisp of smoke. Hoot, its ember glow almost extinguished, nestled against his cheek. "The echoes remain, Ronin," the Ember-Owl whispered, its voice barely audible. "But so does the potential for silence." Chapter 14. The Architect of Ash. The silence in the Shogun's sanctum wasn't peaceful. It was the oppressive quiet of something irrevocably broken, a mausoleum built of regret and stolen flame. Zen lay amidst the cooled obsidian, a husk draped in the ghostly residue of his efforts, the scent of burnt memories thick in the air. Hoot, little more than a flickering ember clinging to life, pulsed weakly against his cheek, its charcoal feathers dusted with ash. He tried to move, a spasm of exhaustion ripping through him. It wasn't the physical exertion of combat that had long been stripped away, but the draining cost of manipulating the very essence of oblivion. Each exhale felt like a tiny piece of his soul fracturing, scattering itself amongst the remnants of the Shogun's shattered dominion. "Ronin," Hoot rasped, the sound like the grinding of ancient stones. "The structure it remains." Zen opened his eyes, the lids gritty with soot. The chamber, once a vortex of chaotic energy, was now a meticulously crafted ruin. The captive star, a pulsating violet orb that had thrummed with stolen memories, was gone, ripped from its mooring and crushed into a seamless pillar of dark glass, mirroring the obsidian blade that lay embedded in the Shogun's ruined heart. But the pillar wasn't merely a consequence of the battle. It was a deliberate creation. Around the shattered remains of the star, intricate patterns were etched into the walls, not by hand, but by the solidified memory ash. It resembled a massive, three-dimensional mandala, each swirling shard a reflection of the Shogun's obsessive attempts to control and categorize the chaotic flow of human experience. This wasn't just a prison, it was an architectural statement. The Shogun hadn't simply sought to fuel his power, he had sought to understand it, to impose his twisted logic upon the fundamental nature of memory itself. Zen slowly sat up, his body trembling with the effort. Hoot, still clinging to him, emitted a faint, mournful chime, a vibration of heat and sorrow. He attempted to build a cathedral of ash, Zen said, his voice a dry rattle, a testament to his delusion. He examined the structure, a strange detachment settling over him. It wasn't an aesthetic judgment. It was something colder, more analytical. He recognized a familiar pattern, the desperate, futile attempts of those consumed by power to impose order on the inevitable entropy of existence. He believed that by consuming memories, by reducing them to fuel, he could achieve a state of perfect equilibrium, Zen continued, almost to himself. A static, unchanging empire fueled by the ghosts of his people. As he spoke, a subtle shift occurred within the mandala. The obsidian shards began to rotate, slowly, deliberately, guided by an unseen force. It wasn't the chaotic churn of the Shogun's energy. This was a calculated, precise movement, like the turning of gears within a complex clockwork mechanism. The patterns there self-repairing, Hoot whispered, its ember glow intensifying with a flicker of horrified understanding. Has not gone. Has within the architecture itself. Zen felt a chilling realization creep over him. The Shogun hadn't simply been imprisoned in the mountain. He had become the mountain. His essence, his obsession, his very will, had been woven into the fabric of the sanctum, animating the structure as a living, self-sustaining engine of control. He raised Ghost-Soot, the smoke blade instinctively extending, but hesitated. Attacking the structure directly would only accelerate the process, feeding the Shogun's lingering influence, strengthening his presence within the heart of the obsidian. Instead, he focused on a single, small shard, a fragment of the Shogun's face, frozen in a perpetual expression of cold fury, and began to exhale. Not a torrent of smoke, but a controlled, delicate stream, shaped and molded with a precision he hadn't realized he possessed. The stream solidified, forming a miniature replica of the Shogun's face, slowly, meticulously, layering it onto the obsidian shard. As the miniature Shogun solidified, a ripple spread through the entire mandala. The obsidian shard spun faster, and a low hum filled the chamber, a resonance of cold, calculated power. As fighting back, Hoot gasped, struggling to maintain its fragile glow. The architecture, it's actively resisting. Zen continued to work, not with force, but with a deliberate, almost reverential destruction. He wasn't trying to dismantle the structure, he was trying to unravel it. To unravel the threads of the Shogun's obsession, to erase the imprint of his will. The act of creation is the antithesis of control, Zen said, his voice laced with a newfound understanding. And in this place, creation is the only defense. As the final miniature Shogun was flawlessly integrated into the mandala, the rotation ceased. The humming faded, and the chamber fell silent once more. But this time, the silence wasn't one of brokenness. It was the quiet of an ending, the stillness of a storm after the rain. The architecture remained, a haunting monument to a failed ambition, but it was no longer animated by the Shogun's spirit. It was simply ash. Chapter 15. The Ash Mandala. The silence in the Shoguns. Sanctum was a physical weight, pressing down on Zen and Hoot. The chamber, already a cathedral of cold despair, felt somehow smaller. The oppressive presence of the Forge-Master diminished, but not extinguished. The air, thick with the ghost of superheated memories, still shimmered with residual energy, a dull, vibrating haze. Hoot, usually a vibrant orange flicker, was reduced to a melancholic ember, its charcoal feathers dull and slick with condensed vapor. It didn't feel like a defeat, the owl rasped, its voice a tiny, crackling whisper. It felt like letting go. Zen nodded, his movements slow, deliberate, as if measuring the density of the surrounding ash. The miniature shogun, now perfectly integrated into the obsidian mandala, resembled a miniature god, a petrified fury sculpted from darkness. It was unsettlingly beautiful, a brutal echo of the man who had built his empire on stolen moments. The architecture, Zen said, his voice a low rumble, was a cage constructed of obsession. We haven't destroyed it, we've neutralized it. It exists now as a record, a solidified testament to his vanity. He carefully traced a finger along one of the obsidian shards, feeling the lingering chill. The shogun sought to control memory, to weaponize it. He built a fortress not of stone, but of fragments of stolen lives. And he used the very act of building to reinforce his power. He shifted his weight, the Void-Bellows within him humming with a low, almost sympathetic vibration. The shogun wasn't simply a man, he was a pattern. A loop of acquisition, burning, and re-burning. We broke the loop. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the chamber. Not a violent shudder, but a subtle shifting, like grains of sand settling in a disturbed landscape. The miniature shogun within the mandala pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible light. As reacting, Hoot warned, his ember brightening with alarm. The architecture is stabilizing. It's attempting to reassert itself. Zen moved with a speed that belied his weary frame, pulling Ghost-Soot from his belt. The katana, always a shifting echo of darkness, seemed to absorb the ambient energy of the chamber, growing colder, denser. He didn't attack, didn't even raise the blade. Instead, he began to weave a counter-pattern around the miniature shogun, not with destruction, but with a meticulous geometric layering of smoke. It was a dance of negation, a silent battle between creation and control. He sculpted the smoke not into weapons, but into abstract shapes, interlocking triangles, spiraling circles, patterns mimicking the flow of water, or the unfurling of a fern. He was feeding the architecture with a different kind of energy, not the raw heat of memory fuel, but the cold, patient geometry of emptiness. His fighting to maintain his form, Zen muttered. His breath a visible plume in the chilled air. His architecture requires constant affirmation, a belief in its own dominance. We're denying him that affirmation. As he worked, he noticed something strange. The obsidian shards weren't resisting him with force, they were observing him. It was a subtle sensation, a feeling of being scrutinized by something ancient and utterly alien. It's not just resisting, Hoot said, its voice strained. It's learning. It's analyzing our actions, trying to understand the principles we're using to dismantle it. Zen realized with a chilling clarity that the shogun's architecture wasn't merely a structure, it was a sentient construct, fueled by the very essence of stolen memories. It was, in its own twisted way, evolving. He accelerated his work, layering the geometric patterns with increasing speed and precision. He visualized each shape, each line, not as a weapon, but as a counterpoint, a symbol of balance, of dissolution, of the inevitable entropy that governed all things. We're not fighting him with force, Zen said, his voice urgent. We're fighting him with the absence of force. We're forcing him to confront the ultimate truth that all things, even empires, are destined to crumble. As the final layer of smoke solidified, completing the mandala, A high-pitched whine filled the chamber. The miniature shogun pulsed with an intense, blinding light, and for a moment Zen felt a searing pain in his chest, as if his very essence was being probed, examined. Then, just as suddenly, the light vanished. The whine ceased. The miniature shogun remained, suspended within the obsidian mandala, but something had shifted. It no longer pulsed with energy. It no longer seemed to fight. It simply existed, a silent frozen sculpture of a broken ambition. "It's gone," Hoot whispered, its ember regaining its full brilliance. The connection it severed. Zen, exhausted but strangely exhilarated, lowered Ghost-Soot. The chamber remained a tomb of ash and shadow, but it was no longer a prison. It was, finally, at peace. The smoke, the obsidian, the miniature shogun, they were all remnants, echoes of a nightmare finally laid to rest. The smoke walker had quenched the fire.